The first case occurred on May 2, 2011, at a hospital located in Kaili City, Guizhou Province, China. The atmosphere inside the maternity ward was initially proceeding as normal, like any other day. The wheels of medical carts rolled steadily, echoing rhythmically along the hospital corridor. Family members visiting patients were coming and going busily. But that peace was suddenly shattered by violent commotion erupting from one of the patient rooms. It was a desperate, blood-curdling scream for help. A woman, who had just gone through a dangerous delivery and had only been a mother for 3 days, was being brutally attacked right on her hospital bed. Knife blows struck her neck one after another, repeated relentlessly with unimaginable cruelty, until her head was completely severed from her body. And what made this incident more horrifying than any other murder was the identity of the person holding the knife. Not a stranger who had broken in, not a mentally ill patient who had lost control, but the victim's own husband. This was a bloody family tragedy, a case whose truth and the perpetrator's real motive have been forever buried, sealed away permanently by a single bullet. Yang Tu-xiang, the 42-year-old woman, had just given birth to a baby boy on April 29, 2011. At her age, pregnancy and childbirth always carry more risks compared to younger mothers, and the delivery process had left her body severely exhausted. Recognizing that her health was still weak and needed further monitoring, the doctors advised her to stay in the hospital for continued recovery until her condition truly improved, rather than rushing to be discharged. 3 days later, on May 2, 2011, Tu-xiang was still resting on her hospital bed in the quiet postpartum room. That afternoon, an elderly couple came to visit. They were relatives who came to congratulate her on the birth and brought a pot of hot chicken soup. Tu-xiang sipped the soup while chatting with the elderly couple. Shortly after, around 4 p.m., Longju Li, Tu-xiang's husband, entered the room. The elderly couple immediately stood up to greet him, as is customary when a patient's family member appears. But at that moment, without a word of warning, without any sign of alarm, Ju Li suddenly pulled out a kitchen knife he had hidden on his person, charged straight toward his wife, and began slashing repeatedly at her neck. Everything happened too fast, so fast that no one in that room had time to react. Tu-xiang, the woman who had given birth just 3 days earlier, her body still weak as she lay on the hospital bed, didn't even have a chance to defend herself or cry for help. The elderly couple stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what was happening before their eyes. Then instinctively, the old man rushed forward, trying to stop Ju Li and grab the knife from his hands. But for a man already 70 years old, his strength was no match for someone in a state of frenzy. The old man not only failed to save Tu-xiang, but was pushed to the floor by Ju Li, his arm wounded by the knife. The old woman didn't escape Ju Li's brutality either. In the chaos, her arm was also slashed by the blade. In an instant, what had been a peaceful recovery ward transformed into a bloody, chaotic crime scene. Other patients in the room and visiting family members screamed in panic, pushing and shoving to escape. Frantic screams echoed throughout the hospital corridor, causing medical staff to immediately abandon their work and rush to the postpartum ward to see what was happening. Upon discovering the chaos inside, hospital staff immediately began evacuating other patients from the dangerous area. Hospital security also quickly arrived at the scene, but everyone had to stop at a safe distance. No one dared approach because Ju Li was now in a state of uncontrollable frenzy, wildly swinging his gleaming knife at anyone who dared step closer. A hospital employee immediately called the police, and officers arrived at the scene shortly afterward. The sight that greeted them was truly horrifying. The patient room now looked like a bloody battlefield. Blood had splattered everywhere, sprayed onto the white walls, pooling on the tile floor. Tu-xiang's body lay motionless on the hospital bed, her head completely severed from her body. Seeing the police appear at the door, Ju Li showed no fear or hesitation. On the contrary, he became even more aggressive, frantically swinging the blood-covered knife toward them. The officers tried to persuade him, calling for him to calm down and drop the weapon, but all efforts were futile. Ju Li was now like a wild animal out of control, completely beyond reasoning or calming. The officers then decided to push several medical carts toward Ju Li, hoping to force him back into a corner of the room to subdue him, but Ju Li nimbly dodged, moving back and forth across the room, creating a standoff. At this point, the officers realized they were facing a situation that was no longer simply a murder scene. It had become a tense, deadlocked confrontation. They continued calling for Ju Lee to drop the knife and surrender, but he stubbornly refused, screaming words no one could understand. Then suddenly, Ju Lee moved to the window and threw it wide open. He stood there, continuing to shout nonsensical words toward the crowd of police and civilians gathering below. With the knife still clenched tightly in his hand, he climbed onto the windowsill, standing precariously at a dangerous height. Officers below immediately deployed an inflatable cushion, preparing for the worst-case scenario if he decided to jump or take even more reckless action. This tense standoff lasted over an hour. Police patiently negotiated, trying to convince him to give up, but all efforts failed. Ju Lee absolutely refused to surrender. Finally, at 6:05 p.m., after countless failed negotiations, an officer was forced to open fire. Ju Lee died on the spot. That gunshot ended the nightmare that had lasted over 2 hours and prevented the possibility of additional victims. But that same gunshot also permanently closed the door to the truth. No one would ever know the real reason behind Ju Lee's unbelievably brutal actions toward the wife who had just given birth to his child. Ju Lee was born in 1963 into a poor farming family living in a remote mountainous area of Guizhou province. He was the eldest child in a family of 4 siblings. Due to difficult family circumstances and low educational attainment, Ju Lee had to work to make a living from a very young age. Most villagers, when asked, described Ju Lee as an honest, hard-working, and quiet man, the type who always kept his head down, only knew how to work, and rarely opened his mouth to talk to anyone. However, alongside those observations, many neighbors also admitted they always felt there was something strange about this man, some dark side to his personality that they couldn't name or clearly explain. Before meeting Tu Xiang, Ju Lee had been married twice. His first wife died of illness not long after their wedding. A few years later, through a matchmaker, Ju Lee remarried for the second time. But tragedy repeated itself. His second wife also died after only a short time living together, and this time the cause was said to be suicide. 2 deaths occurring in succession to both wives, both not long after marriage, sparked unflattering rumors throughout the village. Some people began whispering that Ju Lee was a wife killer, cursed with a fate that brought death to any woman who married him. Meanwhile, others believed that behind his quiet, gentle exterior, Ju Lee was actually a violent man who regularly abused and tormented his wives behind closed doors. Over time, Ju Lee's bad reputation in the village spread further and became worse. No parents dared to marry their daughter to him, as everyone feared their child would share the fate of his 2 previous wives. Ju Lee became a widower whom no one wanted to approach, unable to find any woman willing to live with him, even when he was already past 40. In small villages like this, once a bad reputation spreads, it never fades. It only takes deeper root over the years. Just as Ju Lee was beginning to accept that he would have to live alone for the rest of his life, young Tu Xiang appeared. Tu Xiang was 6 years younger than Ju Lee. She was the type of woman who was straightforward, bold in speaking her mind, and strong-willed. When she was young, she was famous throughout the neighboring villages for her beauty. Tu Xiang was no longer a young maiden either. She had been married once and divorced. In 2009, fate brought these 2 people, both searching for their other half, together through a local matchmaker. This matchmaker praised Ju Lee lavishly, completely ignoring his notorious past. According to the matchmaker, Ju Lee was an honest, hard-working man with solid finances, an ideal husband for any woman. Hearing those words, Tu Xiang was persuaded and agreed to meet. Ju Lee wasn't handsome or attractive in appearance, but through his quiet demeanor and gentle manner, Tu Xiang got the impression that he was a sincere, trustworthy man. Not long after their first meetings, the 2 began developing feelings for each other and officially became a couple. When Tu Xiang's parents learned their daughter was dating Ju Lee, the man notorious for having been married twice with both wives dying under abnormal circumstances, they immediately reacted strongly. They fiercely opposed this marriage, refusing to allow their daughter to enter that ill-fated household. Tu Xiang's father even warned his daughter in the sternest terms that one day this man would also kill her, whether directly by his own hand or indirectly by driving her to destruction. But Tu Xiang at that time had already been blinded by love. She brushed aside all her parents' warnings, considering them mere superstitious, old-fashioned, and baseless thoughts. In her mind, Julie was a gentleman. It was just bad luck that had caused his two previous wives to die so early. She was determined to marry Julie, determined to prove to her parents and the whole world that her choice was absolutely right. This stubborn woman had no idea that with this decision, she had already stepped 1 foot through the gates of death. Without her parents' blessing, Tu Xiang still insisted on going through with the wedding to Julie. But the married life she received after the wedding was nothing like what she had dreamed of. The moment she set foot in her husband's house, Tu Xiang was shocked to discover she had been blatantly deceived by the matchmaker. Julie's house was tiny, shabby, and dilapidated, with almost nothing of value inside, worlds apart from the image of a hard-working, well-off man with stable finances that the matchmaker had painted all along. Forget about being well-off or financially stable. In reality, Julie didn't even have a decent job. He didn't own a single plot of land he could call his own. Every day, Julie worked as a hired hand on neighbors' fields, earning meager wages that weren't even enough to cover the most basic needs of the couple's life. Tu Xiang realized she had been painfully deceived, and with her straightforward nature, she began frequently scolding her husband and threatening to leave for her parents' home. At first, Julie gritted his teeth and endured, trying his best to hold the marriage together. He single-handedly took care of everything in the house, from cooking to cleaning, while also taking on various odd jobs outside to earn extra income. All the money he earned, he brought home and handed over to his wife without keeping a single cent. But as the pressure from his wife's constant criticism and complaints increased, Julie could no longer keep silent and endure. He began fighting back, arguing with his wife, especially after drinking. The man once known as gentle and quiet had now transformed into a completely different person, violent, aggressive, and ready to raise his hand against his wife. Facing this frightening change in her husband, Tu Xiang gradually changed her attitude too. She began fearing Julie and tried to keep her distance from him, learning when to speak up and when to stay silent to avoid the beatings. Not only Tu Xiang, even the neighbors felt uneasy whenever they witnessed Julie's attitude and behavior when he was drunk. Alcohol had truly transformed this man into someone terrifying. Gone was the timid man who always kept his head bowed to the ground. And it didn't stop at becoming violent. Alcohol also caused serious damage to Julie's health. Due to heavy drinking over a long period, his health gradually deteriorated, both physically and mentally. At unpredictable times, Julie would suddenly fall into states of delusion and hallucination, behaving like someone who had lost his mind. According to one villager's account, there was one time when Julie and a group of villagers took a train to another place for work. Everything was proceeding normally when suddenly Julie clutched his head and began screaming frantically, shouting that someone was trying to kill him. Then, the next moment, to the horror of those around him, he jumped straight off the train as it was traveling at high speed. For the villagers, such bizarre behavior from Julie made them extremely concerned and caused them to distance themselves from him even more. But for Tu Xiang, that incident carried a far more frightening meaning. It was clear evidence that the husband she was living with was not only poor and alcoholic, but also had serious mental health problems. He was like a ticking time bomb sitting right inside her own home, never knowing when it would explode and endanger her life at any moment. However, entering the second year of their marriage, just as Tu Xiang was feeling unsafe and no longer secure being beside her husband, she discovered she was pregnant. This news put her in a dilemma. On one hand, she wanted to get away from this dangerous man. On the other, she was carrying his child. But there was one positive thing. Julie received the news of his wife's pregnancy with immense joy. As if the child in his wife's womb had awakened something within him, Julie decided to quit drinking and completely changed his attitude. He became gentler, spoiling his wife and fulfilling her every wish throughout her pregnancy. Finally, on April 29, 2011, Tu Xiang gave birth to a healthy baby boy via cesarean section. Ju Li welcomed the birth of his son with overflowing happiness. He couldn't stop smiling with satisfaction, continuously thanking everyone who came to visit his wife and child at the hospital. But behind the happiness of welcoming their newborn son, an enormous pressure was silently weighing down on this couple: the financial problem. The cost of cesarean surgery plus hospitalization for recovery was not small at all, while their family had nothing to begin with. Ju Li had to run around everywhere, knocking on the doors of every acquaintance to borrow money, taking whatever he could get. Finally, after days of begging everywhere, he managed to scrape together 8,000 yuan, roughly equivalent to $1,100. That amount should have been enough to pay all the hospital bills and bring his wife and child home. But for some unknown reason, at noon that day, just a few hours before the tragedy occurred, Ju Li appeared in his wife's hospital room with a puzzled expression and announced that only half of the money remained. When Tu Xiang demanded to know where the other half had gone, Ju Li only stammered out vague, incoherent answers. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to that money, whether he was swindled by someone, whether it was stolen, or whether he himself had spent it on something else. The money that was supposed to bring his wife and child home had mysteriously vanished without any reasonable explanation. Naturally, this made Tu Xiang unable to contain her fury. She exploded right there in the hospital room, no longer caring how many people were watching. In front of everyone, Tu Xiang berated and called Ju Li a stupid, useless husband who couldn't do anything right. She was certain that her husband had secretly squandered the borrowed money on himself, without any thought for his wife and child, without thinking about how to get them out of the hospital. At the peak of her rage, Tu Xiang declared that she would contact her parents for help paying the hospital bill, and that she wanted to divorce Ju Li. Every word from his wife's mouth was like a knife stabbing through Ju Li's already fragile and unstable psyche. Without saying a word, he turned his back and left the hospital room, walking out of the hospital in silence. It turned out that after leaving the hospital, the 48-year-old man went straight to the market. There, he bought a fairly large kitchen knife, hid it carefully on his person, then returned to his wife's hospital room. Tu Xiang at that time was still sitting and chatting happily with the elderly couple who had come to visit, completely unaware that death was approaching step by step. It's true that Tu Xiang had gotten angry and harshly berated her husband and had uttered the word divorce. But the context needs to be clearly understood. She was angry because Ju Li had lost or spent all the money they needed to pay the hospital bills to bring herself and their son home. Moreover, Tu Xiang had only given birth 3 days earlier. Her body was still weak and her emotions were in an unstable phase like any other new mother. According to the elderly couple who witnessed the scene, when Ju Li entered the room the second time, Tu Xiang smiled and greeted her husband normally. Her earlier anger seemed to have subsided, but no one could have anticipated what happened next. Ju Li suddenly pulled out the knife he had hidden and attacked his wife. The forensic examination later confirmed that Tu Xiang had been stabbed a total of 76 times, a number that shows a level of frenzy and brutality that's hard to imagine. As mentioned at the beginning, the tense standoff lasting over an hour between Ju Li and the police force ultimately ended with the perpetrator's own death. The wife was murdered savagely, right on her hospital bed. The husband died from police gunfire. And this case closed with questions that will never have answers. What really happened? And why did Ju Li bring himself to act so cruelly toward the wife who had just given birth to his child? But it turned out the story didn't end there. After the deaths of both husband and wife, something unexpected happened. Both families agreed to bury Tu Xiang and Ju Li together in the same grave. This decision was extremely contradictory because at the same time, both families were constantly blaming and criticizing each other. Ju Li's family claimed that Tu Xiang's sharp tongue and inability to hold her words was what provoked and led to the tragedy. Meanwhile, Tu Xiang's family countered that it was impossible for just a few words spoken in anger to lead to such a horrific act. They believed that, at his core, Ju Li was a mentally ill man with the heart of a devil. Even if Ju Li had been hurt by his wife's words, that could never justify his savage murder of his own wife, a woman who had given birth to his child just 3 days earlier. Because both main characters in this tragic story have passed away, Ju Li's true motive will never be revealed. The content of this story was compiled based on news articles that interviewed both families and some villagers. As for the police, they officially closed the case with the conclusion that the murder was triggered by uncontrollable emotions stemming from the perpetrator's mental disorder, combined with prolonged family conflicts, plus the financial pressure that had weighed on this couple from the very first days of their marriage. The second case occurred in the United States. In September 2024, a female nurse from Oregon failed to show up for work at the hospital as usual. This was completely out of character for her, someone who was always punctual and dedicated to her job. Concerned about their colleague, hospital staff reported her suspicious disappearance to the police. Officers quickly arrived at her apartment to investigate, but found no trace of her. The apartment was empty. Her wallet and personal belongings had vanished, while her car remained parked intact in the building's parking lot. This mysterious disappearance quickly shocked the local community, drawing public attention, and many volunteers joined the police in a large-scale search operation. But the most heartbreaking part was that when she was finally found, she had become a cold corpse. Not only that, the marks on her body showed that before death, she had endured cruel, inhumane treatment. And what made this case even more chilling was the identity of the killer. He wasn't a stranger, but someone who lived right next to her, very close by, right under everyone's nose. In 2024, Melissa turned 32 years old and was living and working in Oregon. She was a Filipino-American, born in 1992 in Washington State to an ordinary working-class family. Both her parents were from the Philippines and had left their homeland to build a new life in America when they were young. After years of hard work, they gradually stabilized their lives, settled permanently in the U.S., and had Melissa and her older brother. Melissa grew up in Bremerton, Washington. She attended the University of Washington in Seattle and completed her studies in 2018, earning a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. After graduating, Melissa left her family and moved from Bremerton to settle in Portland, Oregon, working as a nurse in the administrative department at Providence St. Vincent Hospital. Melissa was a friendly, kind-hearted girl with a loving nature and a strong sense of responsibility at work. She was always dedicated to caring for every patient assigned to her, never doing her job carelessly or half-heartedly. Thanks to her serious work ethic and dedication, Melissa was considered an outstanding nurse, beloved by both colleagues and patients alike. In her personal life, Melissa had a boyfriend she had been with for 10 years named Brian. He was also Filipino-American like her, 1 year older than Melissa, and grew up on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Brian was a serviceman in the United States Navy and also served as a physical therapist in the military. Melissa and Brian first met at Mokulea Beach on Oahu Island in a completely chance encounter. At the time, Melissa was on summer break from college and flew to Hawaii with a group of friends for vacation. It was during that trip that she met Brian, a local guy living on the beautiful island. After that fateful meeting, they exchanged phone numbers to stay in touch. Through text messages and phone calls, their ordinary friendship gradually blossomed into love. Despite living thousands of miles apart, they decided to pursue this challenging long-distance relationship. In 2023, Brian was assigned by the military to work at Bremerton Naval Hospital in Washington State as a physical therapist. That same year, Brian proposed to Melissa in his hometown of Hawaii, and she said yes. On August 24, 2024, Melissa and Brian officially tied the knot. They held their wedding in Hawaii, where they first met, witnessed by family and close friends at the beautiful Waimea Valley. Everyone thought that after the wedding, Melissa would begin enjoying a sweet, married life with the man she had loved for a decade. The future seemed wide open for the newlyweds. But no one could have imagined that less than 2 weeks after their special day, Melissa would encounter a terrifying disaster, and her life would forever end at age 32. After receiving the report from Melissa's colleagues, Beaverton police quickly arrived at her apartment located at 1050 Southwest 161st Avenue, Beaverton. However, when police rang the doorbell, no one answered. They knocked multiple times, but inside remained completely silent, as if the apartment was empty. After obtaining permission, police entered the apartment to investigate, but still found no trace of Melissa. Notably, her purse, wallet, and personal items she usually carried were not in the home. Police expanded their search, combing through the entire apartment building but found nothing. The only thing they discovered was Melissa's car still parked intact in the building's parking lot, a detail that made them even more concerned, because if Melissa had gone somewhere on her own, she would certainly have driven. To find clues, police investigated Melissa's bank and credit card records, but the results showed that since her disappearance, no transactions had been made. Furthermore, Melissa's cell phone couldn't be reached. It appeared to have been powered off, or the battery was dead. This left police at a dead end, as they had no way to determine Melissa's last location through her phone signal. Therefore, police contacted Melissa's newlywed husband Brian to gather more information. However, Brian appeared extremely surprised and worried upon hearing that his wife was missing. He said the last time he had contact with Melissa was around 6 a.m. that day. After that, he was busy with work at the hospital and hadn't received any texts or calls from his wife. He assumed Melissa was also busy with her shift. Following standard investigation procedures, family members are always the first suspects in missing persons cases. Police were no exception, initially suspecting that Melissa's disappearance might be connected to Brian. However, after verification, they quickly ruled out this possibility because Brian was in Bremerton, over 185 miles from Beaverton. With such geographical distance, he couldn't possibly be involved in the incident. According to Melissa's mother-in-law, Imelda, her son Brian and Melissa had held their wedding in their hometown of Hawaii on August 24th. After the ceremony, Brian, Melissa, and the whole family flew back to Washington State on the evening of August 31st, landing in the early hours of September 1st. They gathered together, rested, and celebrated through Labor Day on September 2nd. Afterward, due to work, Melissa had to drive alone back to her apartment in Beaverton, Oregon, to prepare to return to work at the hospital on September 3rd. The newlyweds temporarily had to live apart because of both their work situations. No one expected that just one day after returning to work, Melissa would suddenly lose contact with everyone. Based on years of investigative experience, police concluded that Melissa's sudden disappearance was very likely due to kidnapping. They reached this conclusion based on several unusual signs at the scene. Valuable items in Melissa's apartment were all intact with no signs of being searched or stolen, only the personal belongings she usually carried were missing. From these details, police quickly ruled out the possibility of robbery or criminals acting for money. Instead, they hypothesized that Melissa might have been targeted by someone with a personal grudge seeking revenge. However, when police interviewed Melissa's relatives, friends, and colleagues, everyone unanimously confirmed that Melissa was a gentle, kind-hearted girl who was always willing to help others and had never made enemies with anyone. She had no enemies and no serious conflicts with anyone that would warrant such revenge. This left police at an impasse. They couldn't determine the motive of whoever had kidnapped Melissa. A few hours after Melissa was reported missing, police officially opened a case file and began their investigation. At 9 p.m., they posted a missing person flyer about Melissa on the Beaverton Law Enforcement Agency's official page, while also notifying major media outlets to pay attention to the case. Beaverton police declared this a very unusual disappearance, that authorities were using every available resource to search for Melissa, and called on the public to come forward with any relevant information if they had seen her. On September 5, 2024, a full 24 hours had passed since Melissa went missing. In kidnapping cases, the golden window for rescuing victims is typically within the first 72 hours. After this time, the chances of finding the victim alive decrease significantly. Therefore, police had to race against time, utilizing every second to search and save Melissa's life. They mobilized a large police force along with professionally trained K-9 units to thoroughly search the entire apartment building where Melissa lived. The police dogs tried to track her scent, while officers knocked on every resident's door in the building, hoping to gather some useful clues about what happened the day Melissa disappeared. Early in the morning on September 6, 2024, at 7 a.m., Melissa's family, along with a volunteer search team organized by her friends, began expanding their search to the areas surrounding the apartment building. About 100 enthusiastic volunteers participated in this search operation. They continuously posted missing person flyers for Melissa throughout the neighboring areas and on light poles. Some kind-hearted residents even went online and to blogs to recruit more volunteers, gathering at a parking lot near Melissa's apartment, then spreading out to conduct a grid search of all the trails, alleys, and streets in the area. But after an exhausting day of searching, they returned empty-handed without any results. Melissa's family grew increasingly anxious and worried about her mysterious disappearance. By this point, Melissa had been missing for over 48 hours. Although hope was becoming more fragile with each passing hour, her family refused to give up, still praying that Melissa could return safely. They hoped for a miracle. But tragically, fate ultimately showed no mercy to the kind-hearted girl. The dreaded news that her family had prayed would never come finally arrived. At 3:02 a.m. on September 7, 2024, police officially announced heartbreaking news. They had found Melissa's body. At the same time, they also arrested a male suspect connected to the case named Bryce Jonathan Schubert. When Melissa's body was discovered, there were many visible wounds on her person, indicating that before death, she had endured cruel, inhumane treatment. The forensic examination determined the cause of death was strangulation. Based on the evidence collected, police concluded that Melissa had most likely been killed on the same day she was kidnapped, meaning that while the search operation was still underway, she was already gone from this world. The suspect, Bryce, was only 27 years old when arrested. What shocked everyone was that he was Melissa's neighbor, living in the same apartment building as her. Bryce was also a male nurse with a tall, muscular build, born on January 11, 1997, and raised in Oregon. According to police investigation, the hospital where Bryce had worked was about 12 miles from Melissa's hospital. Bryce had also never worked at Melissa's hospital. The two worked at completely different places and appeared to have no connection through work. On September 9, 2024, Bryce appeared in court for the first time at Washington County Court in Hillsboro, Oregon. At the hearing, prosecutors formally charged him with serious offenses including first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and second-degree abuse of a corpse. After the hearing, Bryce was held at Washington County Jail in Oregon awaiting further proceedings. His preliminary hearing was scheduled for September 16th. On September 16th, 2024, Bryce attended his first hearing via video link from jail. During this hearing, the Washington County Grand Jury decided to add another charge against Bryce, second-degree murder. Through his defense attorney, Bryce declared not guilty to all charges and entered a plea of not guilty. The court decided to continue holding him without bail. At that time, the courtroom was packed with Melissa's relatives and friends who came to attend. They all wanted to see with their own eyes the person who had taken their loved one's life. When they heard Bryce plead not guilty, they all appeared extremely angry and outraged. On October 15, 2024, Bryce appeared in court again at Washington County Court. Outside the courthouse, a group of people gathered holding signs, vowing to seek justice for Melissa, the innocent girl who had died so tragically. Since the case occurred, police have only disclosed to the public that Melissa's body was found, but the specific location where the body was discovered has not been released. Regarding the details of Melissa's cause of death, police have also kept quiet, only stating that Bryce used some type of weapon that caused Melissa to suffer extremely cruel permanent injuries in her final moments. Additionally, police revealed that during the time Melissa was missing, they mobilized massive resources for investigation and searching. Through meticulous evidence collection over several days, they confirmed that Bryce, who lived in the same apartment building as Melissa, was directly connected to her disappearance and murder. However, exactly what evidence established the link between Bryce and Melissa, police have not disclosed. As of now, Bryce remains incarcerated at Washington County Jail, awaiting further hearings and trials. Melissa's case is still under investigation with no final verdict yet. Perhaps in the near future, when the case goes to official trial, police and the court will reveal details about how Bryce committed the crime, and justice will be served for Melissa. This sudden tragedy dealt a devastating blow to Melissa's family. Melissa was the youngest daughter in the family, loved and spoiled by her father and older brother since childhood. She was not only an obedient, devoted daughter, but also a kind-hearted angel in the eyes of everyone who knew her. What do you think the verdict should be for Bryce? Please share in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.